Now, I'm conscious, I should say, on the disparity of the time that we're spending on different groups, and it's worth thinking about the sort of numbers of these volunteer movements at the outset. The Ulster Volunteer Force that I'm talking about tonight, arguably the first formed, is about 100,000, 110,000 strong at its height in the summer of 1914. We're not quite sure about the numbers. Police reports vary. Internal UVF paperwork isn't particularly good, and as I'll say later on, there is a big issue about the number of non-attenders at various UVF parades, drills and so on, but we seem to come up with a paper figure around the 100,000 mark. The Irish National Volunteers that I'll be talking about in a few weeks' time get probably as high as 180,000 members by the August of 1914. Not as well organised as the Ulster Volunteer Force, starting rather later, but obviously as you'll work out from that, a much larger force. Other ones that we're looking at are much smaller. The Young Citizen Volunteers that I'll be talking about next week, probably only about 1,200 strong at their height, but important in looking at ideas about civic military, how Ireland fitted in with the territorial force and army reforms that had come together in Britain just before the First World War, so it's one well worth looking at. The labour movement, if we're thinking of the very socialist Irish Citizens Army, we're possibly looking at as little as 400 members there, but still a significant organisation, important because of its role in the Easter Rising. And we could of course reflect, and will reflect when we get there, that when we're looking at the labour movement and volunteering, the Belfast shipyards provide essentially an entire UVF regiment, so if we're thinking about volunteers and the labour movement, that's a very obvious analogy to draw. And then in terms of women and the various volunteer movements, we're probably looking at something in the region of around 10,000 women involved in the various organisations. In the Ulster Volunteer Force, very much limited to nursing and signalling duties. In some of the Irish Republican movements, rather more active. Constantine Markovich often talked about as one of the leaders of the Eastern Rising, so that's an interesting dynamic for us to tease out there as well. Now, the term that we've used for these as volunteer is in some ways rather problematic, but of course it is a less charged term than paramilitary, which is the other phrase that could have been used. When my book came out, Carson's Army, Charles Townsend amongst others reviewed it and said that I used the term paramilitary there, and it was problematic because this then seemed to link the Ulster Volunteers of 1910, 1914 in with the later paramilitary movements post-1966, and also raised connections with fascism in Europe in the interwar period, where the term paramilitary is actually coined in the 1930s. But equally, the term volunteer is a little problematic. The Ulster Volunteer Force and the Irish Volunteers both look back to the Irish volunteer movement of the 1770s and 1780s. So there's a conscious attempt by both of those movements to locate themselves in what's thought of as a volunteering tradition. And certainly D.W. Miller has talked about the idea of an Ulster Protestant volunteering tradition, which you can trace back to the plantations and all the way forward, if you want to the more modern paramilitary groups via the UDR, Ulster Special Constabulary, Irish Yeomanry, and various other groups. So there are sort of problems about where you locate the volunteer movement and what sort of pedigree you give it that we'll come back to. Worth also saying at the outset that these movements are largely paper taggers. The vast majority of the volunteers of 1912 to 16 saw no military action. Only a tiny minority of Irish volunteers, Irish Citizens Army, 1,200 at the outside, saw action as volunteers during the Easter Rising. The other volunteers of this period that saw military action saw it as members of the British Army, and we will discuss that a little more this evening as well. Something that I haven't devoted an entire lecture to in the series, but something that will keep cropping up, is the role of Irishmen in the British Army over this period. There was a well-developed amateur military tradition in Ireland by 1914. I'll say more about that next week when we look at the Young Citizen Volunteers. But suffice to note now that while the territorial force had not been formed in Ireland, as in Great Britain in 1908, there was quite a lot of part-time soldiering going on in Ireland. There were 21 what were called special reserve units in Ireland which were largely derived from the old militia units, and these allowed men to go on an annual camp each year for about 3 weeks. That was the level of training provided there. One of the special reserve units was the North Irish Horse, the other the South Irish Horse, who did training at a more structured sort of weekly basis and so on. But a lot of these special reserve units only met up in the summer. But that still means that in Ireland we had something like 12 to 14,000 men, Catholics and Protestants, serving as auxiliary parts of the British Army. So that was something that obviously impacts a little on volunteering. Some men that were involved in those units were quite happy to also be involved in the other volunteer units. Indeed, in London, the War Office becomes very concerned about the North Irish Horse, saying that they are all black Protestants and will desert to a man if things kick off, and that they would simply go off in block to the Ulster Volunteer Force. So that gives you some idea of the concerns that were going on there. In addition, of course, Ireland still provided large numbers of recruits to the regular army in peacetime, nowhere near those sort of high water marks in the 1830s, 1840s, when almost half of the British Army had been Irish. But in the 1913 army reform, the British Army reckoned that they had just under 21,000 Irishmen serving in the British Army, compared to about 180,000 Englishmen serving the British Army. Scots, 17,000, Welsh 3,000, so the Irish contingent the second largest after in England in terms of the UK. Now there's a discussion for another time to be had about how many of these men enlisted in the British Army out of economic reasons rather than any great sense of patriotism or pride in the British Empire, but it is a significant number. Having said that, an outside observer looking at Ireland in 1911 would have been struck by how unmilitarised the society was compared to Great Britain. In Great Britain at that time, the territorial force had an establishment of about 200,000 men, never quite reached it, but that was its establishment, and had a footprint in most towns and large villages. We can compare that to today, when the new reforms that are being talked about for the territorial army talk about raising it to the dizzy heights of 20,000 members. So that gives you some idea of just how large it was back before the First World War. Of course, if we go beyond that, the UK, unlike most states in Europe before the First World War, didn't have a conscript system. So many people looked at Britain as being a rather pacifist state in some ways compared to its European rivals. And there was a lot of work in Britain by the National Service League to try and introduce a form of conscription there, but that essentially received very little support, and it was seen as something very un-British, un-English to introduce conscription. And of course it's only introduced in 1916 after the voluntary system in Britain seemed to fail during the First World War. So that's by way of preface about the series, which hopefully throws up some of the ideas that I hope to sort of tease out with you over the next 5 weeks. To turn to the Unionist Volunteers, the Ulster Volunteer Force itself, by way of introduction, we should of course recognise that the Ulster Volunteer Force was part of a much wider Unionist campaign against the Third Home Rule Bill. Third Home Rule Bill introduced in 1911. This isn't really resolved until shortly after the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. This Unionist campaign retains very much a parliamentary focus throughout that 3-year period. There's no point where Carson sort of gives up on the parliamentary system and opts for alternatives, definitely. But also there are popular elements that are involved in this campaign against Home Rule. The League and Covenant of September 1912 is one that's talked about as mobilising the unorganised unionism, as it was referred to at the time, and you'll be familiar, many of you, from a lecture I gave in that last year, of the sort of crowds that were involved in that, possibly the largest crowd in Irish history, seen at Belfast City Hall in September 1912. Beyond that, there were the Unionist clubs that were formed from 1911, which in most places are the basis of drill, the drilling that then leads into the Ulster Volunteer Force. And the other movement that's very large is the Ulster Women's Unionist Council. And women do an awful lot more than simply make the tea. In unionism in this period, it's noticeable that in some areas the women's movement seems to be the pioneer movement. Certainly, I was looking at some areas in the sort of border counties. It appeared that the women were often taking the lead in organising things and getting in guest speakers like James Craig to come down and dress them, and that the unionist clubs were formed after the women's clubs, so quite a lot of activity there as well. The leader of all this is, of course, Edward Carson, who I've got various slides of here. I'll show you what we'll start with. Carson there reviewing what has to be said, not an incredibly enthusiastic group of Ulster Volunteers, I think somewhere in Fermanagh, so we can only suspect that it's been raining quite heavily before his arrival, and that this accounts for the rather slouched appearance of a number of them. And I think there is an umbrella in the back there which tells it all. Carson, as a Dublin barrister, was a very unlikely generalissimo of this Ulster Army. Indeed, unlike his predecessors and the successor of Irish Unionism, he had no military experience. His immediate predecessor, Walter Long, had been a yeomanry colonel. His immediate successor, James Craig, had served as a captain in the South African War. It seems likely that Carson established the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1913 to provide a disciplined province-wide movement which would be good for propaganda purposes. What Carson seems to have been concerned about is that unionism would go in various directions. Some of it would devolve into rioting and protests of that sort, which wouldn't do much for the unionist cause in propaganda terms in Great Britain. So I think that's one of the motivations for the Ulster Volunteer Force. The other one is to try and give a sort of province-wide imprint to suggest that unionist opposition is uniform throughout the 9 counties, which of course is to paper over a number of fairly obvious cracks. And then the levels to which the UVF leaders and members felt committed to what we could think of as a military solution by the summer of 1914 is highly debatable. I tend to agree with Alvin Jackson's view of all this when he says that basically Carson created a Frankenstein's monster, which by mid-1914 was starting to take on a life of its own, and a number of those in the UVF were very concerned about some of the partition ideas, the idea that parts of Fermanagh would be partitioned off and so on. And I think Carson then is being pushed in directions that really he was fundamentally quite unhappy with. Unlike the Irish volunteers, who could look to a moment of creation, the 25th of November 1913 at the Rotunda Rink in Dublin, which we'll look at in detail in a few weeks' time, the Ulster Volunteer Force came together over a lengthy period. Unionist drilling was evident to the police as early as 1910, so even before the Parliament Act enters, even before the Home Rule Bill comes into the House of Commons, there were isolated experiences of drilling, and that building on small-scale examples during the first and second Home Rule Bills back in 1886 and 1883, and arguably, as we've said, fitting in this much wider Protestant volunteering tradition. But it was to be early 1914 before the Ulster Volunteer Force was properly organised in some areas, and the appearance is a very patchwork one. It isn't simply the case that areas that are very predominantly Protestant form UVF units early, those that have a small minority of Protestants form them late. It seems to be a very difficult picture that emerges. The Ulster Volunteer movement then, as I've already alluded to, covered the 9 historic counties of Ulster. And the movement was supposedly only open to those who had signed the Covenant, though many men were able to sign the Covenant sort of retrospectively. There's a number of cases where men were able to go along, sign the Covenant, and then enroll in the UVF long after September 1912. Beyond that, there was also a version of the Ulster Volunteer Force in Dublin, the Loyal Dublin Volunteers, supposedly about 3,000 strong, but incredibly little paperwork seems to survive in them, beyond a few newspaper reports. Another movement that features in with the Ulster Volunteers is the British League for the Support of Ulster and the Union. This is a British-based body set up by Lord Willoughby de Broke, which attracts a number of retired regular army officers who are then sent over to command units of the Ulster Volunteer Force, particularly in Belfast, where there were problems in securing enough officers. There's also evidence that Ulster Volunteer Force units were organised in Glasgow, but there they seem to have been organised under the guise of athletics clubs, which is quite interesting because throughout the 9 counties of Ulster, it appears that most UVF units were drilling in public at some stage. Some, of course, were drilling in public halls, in works buildings, warehouses, so on, but a number of public displays, presentations, and so on, whereas in Glasgow that doesn't seem to have been so definitely the case. The Ulster Volunteers were never more than a partially armed force, and as we'll see, a lot of the firearms were very old and really only useful for propaganda purposes. There's a suggestion that if some of these things had been fired, they were more likely to be injurious to the person firing it than anybody standing at the far end of the rifle, and certainly there's a few cases of that. And then we'll sort of end up today's lecture looking at the formation of the 36th Ulster Division, largely based on the UVF organisation, but many UVF members joined other units, and there wasn't a sort of massive rush to the colours to fill the division, which meant that the Ulster Division only reached its establishment in March 1915, so it's a little more problematic raising that division than is sometimes allowed. So to turn then to the formation of the Ulster Volunteers, there's isolated drilling by individuals, small groups of friends, Orange Lodges and so on as early as 1910, but it's the formation of the Unionist clubs in 1911 and into 1912 which really sees much more widespread drilling taking place. The Enniskillen Horse has some claims to be the first UVF unit, and there's a photograph of it there. I should say that the numbers at the top there show the PRONI collections that these have been drawn from, so if you want to have a look at them in more detail yourself, that's the place to go to. The Enniskillen Horse there in the centre of the town of Enniskillen itself. This was formed by the Maverick newspaper proprietor and editor William Copeland Trimble, no relation to that Trimble, in case that's what you're thinking of, who was the owner and editor of the Impartial Reporter newspaper. And what Trimble was thinking of was propaganda. Carson was going to visit Enniskillen on the 18th of September 1912 to launch the Covenant, Covenant Trail, a series of public meetings he had leading up to the 20th of September in Belfast. And Trimble was concerned about how that would look to the press from GB particularly. So on the 3rd of September 1912, Trimble issues a circular letter to various Unionists in the area around Enniskillen, and he says that other places may have their meetings. Enniskillen must have one great distinctive feature of its own. This escort will be the greatest feature of the day. As the Enniskillen meeting will be the first to be addressed by Sir Edward Carson in this campaign, unusual importance attaches to it, and newspapers will be represented from all parts of the globe. It is therefore all the more incumbent on us that our mounted escort be no childish affair with clumsy men and unmanageable horses, but a fine turnout of smart, soldierly-looking men, well-groomed horses, and all showing the effects of organisation and discipline. Trimble's letter seems to have some impact. The police say that at this meeting on the 18th of September, about 200 men turn out mounted in the Enniskillen Horse. I'm not quite sure, looking at that, if they really look like a regular cavalry regiment or anything much approaching it would have looked at the time, but clearly it makes some sort of impact, at least in propaganda terms. However, there are problems in seeing what Trimble does as the formation of the UVF, or a clarion call to arms, because throughout late 1912 and into 1913, what Trimble tries to do is to get this regiment, as he keeps calling it, only a squadron strength of course in military terms at the time, tries to have that incorporated into the British Army as a yeomanry unit. He writes to the War Office, says that the territorial force hasn't been extended to Ireland, and here's essentially a territorial force regiment for them if only they'll take it on, and then asks them could they send them some rifles please. Not surprisingly, the British government isn't terribly keen on this suggestion, and that sort of whole idea of it becoming a regular regiment, territorial regiment, flounders. But in any case, that sort of shows you some of the problems of sort of loyalty and unionism that were going on at the time, and how this would all fit in with British military structures and British imperial designs. The actual term Ulster Volunteer Force appears to have been used publicly for the first time by Colonel Sharman Crawford of Crawfordsburn in County Down when addressing Bangor Unionist Club on the 22nd of December 1912. He spoke there of the arrangements for recruiting the new organisation, and in terms of the first proper UVF unit to be formed. It seems that the Hollywood company could claim that when Carson goes to visit them in July 1913. They're talked about at that time as the pioneer UVF unit, and I guess the fact that James Craig's house, Craigavon, was close by to Hollywood probably makes that a fairly obvious conclusion. While UVF county committees were set up for the 9 counties of Ulster, consisting of senior local unionists, retired army officers and so on, all set up in December 1912, actually in terms of the recruitment of the Ulster Volunteer Force out in the streets, that's a lot more patchy and with various time lags. A.P. Jenkins, the president of the Lisburn Unionist Club, is pretty sharp off the mark. He started enrolling men for the UVF in Lisburn and also in Dunmurray in January 13 and had recruited 270 men by the end of January 1913, so it started off quite well. Having said that, he continued recruiting for his battalion until March 1914 when it numbered 967 men. So again, sort of issues there about the rush to the colours and so on. By contrast, in Newton Ard's, equally unionist we would say in its composition, recruitment for the UVF didn't begin until the end of February 1913, and until the summer of 1913 it was thought that recruitment remained very sluggish. A fillip was finally provided by Sir Edward Carson's visit to the town in July 1913, so not a pattern that we would perhaps have expected. In South County Londonderry, there seems to have been a significant delay in organising the Ulster Volunteer Force in some rural areas. Whether this was down to finding officers or finding recruits is a bit unclear, but certainly around Brooklanone in January 1914, the local Unionist press was referring to UVF units there as only recently organised, so almost a year after the movement had supposedly been formed. Now, the logical image that one would have of all this would be that the UVF recruitment would have been most backward in the 3 counties where Unionists were in the smallest minorities, Cavan, Donegal, Monaghan. However, Rowan-Irish Constabulary reports noted that recruitment had started for the UVF in Cavan as early as January 1913, and it was seen as being reasonably advanced. So again, a very sort of patchwork picture that we get there of how the UVF came together. Of course, another problem with the formation of the UVF was trying to work out what was a Unionist club and what was a UVF company. In many places it seems that it was essentially the same men with different armbands on, and there's confusion there in the local press. In October 1913, when Carson addressed a Unionist demonstration at Raphoe in County Donegal, the local press there was very confused about what they were witnessing. The start of the newspaper article talks about an Ulster Volunteer demonstration, but then later on in the article they talk about the drill sections of the local Unionist clubs. That confusion is more widespread than simply in some of the rural areas up in the northwest. Indeed, in September and October 1913, letters were sent to all Unionist club members and also to all Irishmen by Carson and by R.H. Wallace, calling on them to enrol in the Ulster Volunteer Force, in the sense that it would be the Ulster Volunteer Force that would be the focus for Unionist opposition to Home Rule rather than the Unionist clubs or the Orange Order. Wallace, earlier on I should say, had said that he didn't think that the Orange Order was a suitable basis for widespread Unionist opposition, because he said that in some small rural areas, Orange lodges were basically about a dozen men, and once you took out your colour party, you didn't really have much left, so he thought that another organisation was a better idea than trying to tack it all on to the existing Orange Order. If we turn to leadership then, I'll give you another slide of Carson to look at. This is Carson with members of the Ulster Signalling and Dispatch Riding Corps. You can see they're very smart and with a nice motorcycle in the background. Quite a lot of photographs of this organisation, which I think was there to show how sort of modern the Ulster Volunteer Force was and how it was using all these new technologies and so on. Carson, as we've said, was reluctant to take on the role of Generalissimo, and this is very awkward now, because I'm conscious there's lots of local historians in the audience that are probably going to catch me out, but I have never seen a photograph of Carson in uniform. This is probably where I get hands going up telling me that there are pictures of him in uniform, but certainly I've never seen one. It's a moot point as to whether Carson was ever actually a member of the Ulster Volunteer Force. He doesn't seem to have been an Orangeman. Again, this is where hands go up. And also, although he had signed the Covenant, he wasn't an Ulsterman by birth or by domicile, so in theory was prohibited from signing that as well. So a very unlikely generalissimo on all sorts of counts. Essentially, Carson is a barrister and doesn't make any bones about that. Carson, indeed, when he's asked about his role in the UVF, says that no, he is not the commanding officer, that this is Lieutenant General Sir George Richardson, who's an retired Indian Army officer, who's brought in to take on that role. Although having said that, it seems that the sort of direction, planning and so on of the Ulster Volunteer Force all essentially was okayed by Carson, so Richardson's role is not a particularly active one, to put it mildly. Who Carson had first wanted to be the General Officer commanding the Ulster Volunteer Force was Field Marshal Lord Roberts, not perhaps a name particularly well known today, but a very famous soldier of his day, an Anglo-Irish soldier who had won the Victoria Cross in the Indian Mutiny, gone on to command in the Terror Campaign, Northwest Frontier, in 1887 to some effect, then commanded out in the South African War, and we seem to have brought that to a successful conclusion after a series of British defeats at the start of the war. He had then been the last Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, so he was a very high-profile name to try and get on board. But Roberts was too involved in the National Service League to also become involved in the Ulster Volunteer Force, so turned down Carson's invitation and instead suggested that Richardson, retired Indian Army officer, Southern Irish Protestant, should be appointed. Richardson's role in all this doesn't seem to have been terribly active. As I've said, he seems to have carried out the odd review, made the odd speech, but providing little real leadership to the force and leaving an awful lot to be resolved at county level. There was, of course, Ulster Volunteer Force headquarters in the Old Town Hall in Belfast, and that did include some talented men. We could look, for example, to Colonel G.W. Hackett-Payne, who was the Chief Staff Officer of the Ulster Volunteer Force, and Captain Wilfred Stender, essentially their Assistant Quartermaster General. Hackett-Payne had considerable combat experience from his time in Sudan and in South Africa, and had held the post of Assistant Adjutant General in the Egyptian Army in 1887, a reasonably significant staff post. Spender was talked about as one of the bright young things of the British Army, had gone into Staff College fairly early, had passed out of it with distinction, and so on. So both of them brought a fair amount of professional knowledge with them to these posts. Having said all that, Spender didn't really live up to all the hype about him being one of the brightest young minds of his generation, in that he entered the First World War as a captain and ended as a lieutenant colonel, so reasonably slow promotion in a war where promotion was exceptionally fast. But that shouldn't distract us from the point that Spender was perfectly competent to carry out the duties that he was allocated at UVF headquarters. Some of the others that were at UVF headquarters had much more flimsy military credentials. Major TVP McCammon is a good case in point. McCammon was an old militia officer, had served in the 5th Royal Irish Rifles, and worked his way up through the commission ranks of that unit. He went on to have a distinguished First World War record and was killed in action in April 1917, leading his men in action, the 2nd Hampshire Regiment at that point. So he was certainly a brave officer, good regimental soldier and so on. But for a short period in 1915, McCammon took over the post of Assistant Adjutant and Quartermaster General with the 36th Ulster Division, and that was not a particularly happy experience for anyone, and the War Office moved him on. So the view that he was a perfectly good regimental officer but couldn't really handle the staff work was basically the conclusion there. So the staff job that he was trying to fill for the UVF was probably beyond his capabilities. A few others were even worse qualified. A man called H.O. Davis had retired from the regular army as a mere lieutenant and seems to have been very poorly qualified to hold the post of senior officer for instructors. Some of the officers giving instruction in rural areas were long retired colonels, so sending a young recently retired lieutenant down to tell them how to run a camp of instruction was not in the face of it a particularly sensible idea. And another oddity that comes up is a man called Lloyd Campbell, who never appears to have held any military rank, but was put into the position of Director of Intelligence for the UVF. The fact that there are no intelligence files amongst the UVF papers probably tells us an awful lot about how well he got on with his duties. So UVF headquarters provided limited direction to the force as a whole, partly because of its limited expertise. A lot of these officers really weren't quite up to the job, but also because of fairly limited funding. Prior to the widespread gun running of April 1914, UVF headquarters wasn't in a position to issue significant numbers of arms. And the allocation, rather hilariously in some cases, of the limited number of camp beds that they had led to endless wrangling. They decided to buy about 1,200 camp beds, and then in the Easter of 1914, various UVF regiments are asking for their quota of camp beds for their annual camp, and many of them are being disappointed and then are getting very annoyed with headquarters, saying why have they used their money to buy these things that they then can't have when they need them. So there's all sorts of problems that go on there. Elsewhere, a lot of the command of UVF units in local areas devolves on the gentry, in many cases retired officers, some North Irish Horse officers, militia officers, and so on, and we can look at a few of those. In Cavan, it's Colonel Oliver Nugent, who retires as a regular army colonel in early 1914, who takes command down there. Nugent has a pretty distinguished career. The outbreak of the First World War sees him recalled to the active list, initially sent off to command a brigade of the 14th Light Division, does well there, put into command the 36th Ulster Division, and at the end of the war is promoted to Lieutenant General, ends up with his last active command in Afghanistan, 1919-1920, not much happier than later incursions into Afghanistan, unfortunately. So Nugent looks after the UVF down in Cavan, sets up camps of instruction, and seems to do quite a good job there. He's also ably assisted there by Lord Farnham, who had held a regular commission briefly, and I should say at this point that an awful lot of landowners back at this time would go into the army for basically short service commissions for a year or two and then would leave the army, so there is some sort of military expertise there. I tend to tell my students that this is a bit like their gap years now, where they sort of go off and dig irrigation ditches in Africa or something like that. It seemed that for that gentry group this was a sort of rite of passage, that they would go into the army rather than go to university. So Farnham had done that, had been a lieutenant in the Lancer Regiment, 17th I think, and then had ended up as a major in the North Irish Horse, so quite good military credentials there, and of course for a fairly small regiment, the Cavan UVF was only ever 2 battalions strong. Other landowners had more flimsy qualifications. Viscount Northland, who commanded the Dungannon UVF battalion, had left the Grenadier Guards as a mere lieutenant, so he's essentially exercising his command there on the basis of being a good, great local landowner rather than being a particularly skilled military practitioner. And the fact that Northland appears to essentially conscript his tenants and so on into his unit doesn't really help that much. But it would be wrong to see the UVF as some sort of feudal hosting, that this was all about the gentry raising out their tenants, as something reminiscent of the Irish yeomanry of the 1790s perhaps. Trimble, when he formed the Enniskillen Horse, wrote truthfully, if it seems rather pompously now, that he was elected to his command because no local gentleman was prepared to take on the role. He said that the gentry really didn't want to get involved in this sort of militarisation of politics, and he then felt that he had no option but to take command himself. Equally, many Protestant professionals and businessmen were looking to identify themselves with the movement for fear of boycott, and these fears weren't exactly groundless. Let me see, I have a few more photographs here which we should flick through. Yeah, that's the UVF, Horse and Manor Cunningham. I put them up because they are sort of under threat of a boycott. In February 1914, the Donegal Independent warns in its columns, there are some shopkeepers in town who, if they desire to retain their Roman Catholic nationalist customers, should advise their sons and employers generally to, if they wish to drill, do so openly but not to give offence. And the newspaper then went on to say that they knew the names of the men who had attended a UVF field day at Manor Cunningham, and that they might go ahead and publish these names if things weren't calmed down in the local area. So these threats of boycott are pretty significant. There's also snobbery over who should be appointed as officers. There's still the idea that an officer should be a gentleman in the British Army of this time, and the system indeed was set up that you had to have a pretty significant private income to be an officer, so if not a gentleman, at least a large bank account was required. And that and the fears of boycotts meant that there were problems in getting the officer ranks filled in Belfast, and also it looked to me at Derry City, though I think I'm going to be told that I'm wrong on that one later on this evening. And certainly in Belfast, a number of the senior officer ranks had to be filled by officers that were procured by the British League for the support of Ulster and the Union that I've mentioned briefly. They got in a number of names that were one that was high profile at the time, one that's become high profile perhaps. For Edwardians back in 1913-14, the name Colonel J.H. Patterson meant quite a lot, and he's brought in supposedly as the commander of the West Belfast Regiment of the UVF. Patterson had written a best-selling book of its day called The Lands of DeSalvo, which was about how he had stalked two lands that were essentially eating large numbers of railway personnel, or navvies that were laying railway lines in Kenya. I think the story is probably better in his book than the truth of it. They did a DNA test recently on the rugs that are left out of the land skins, and came to the conclusion that they'd probably only eaten about 26 people between them, whereas Patterson had said it had gone into the 50s. But anyway, Patterson is a noted big game hunter. This book's a bestseller, and he's a man that the papers latch on to. Another character who comes through the British League for the Support of Ulster and the Union is Percy Crozier, largely unknown at the time, not really featuring very prominently in press reports, but later famous for the large number of books that he writes with such titles as The Men I Killed and Brass Hat in No Man's Land. The men that he killed wasn't really Germans he was talking about, it seemed to be his own men when they tried to get out of things. And Crozier goes on to have a very colourful military career. Brigadier General in the British Army in the First World War, commands the auxiliary division of the RIC, resigns in curious circumstances there as Lieutenant General in the Lithuanian Army. There's a whole raft of things that Crozier gets up to, so again quite a sort of colourful character, but of course ends up with the Ulster Volunteer Force because he'd been kicked out of the British Army for bouncing cheques and had a serious alcohol problem, so it's his way back into military services via the Ulster Volunteer Force. Notably in Fermanagh and Tyrone, a number of clergymen take command of UVF units, and in that photograph that we've seen of Carson, the man on the right obviously is a clergyman, but also you'll notice has 2 campaign medals for South Africa, and I think that this is a chap called W.A. Stack, who had served in the Royal Skin Fusiliers as a lieutenant and then resigned his commission to take up holy orders. So we shouldn't think that all clergy are pacifist and that this is a very unusual thing for them to do. There was great belief in muscular Christianity at the time, and that's one notable example for us. If we turn then to the membership of the Ulster Volunteer Force, there are a few surviving UVF roles, mostly here at PRONI, which provide the names and occupations of those involved, and that allows us to reach some tentative conclusions about the force as a whole. Something that I'm currently involved in doing, that I think it's going to take me some time yet, is matching up roles for Lisburn, parts of Mid-Antrim, parts of Southdown and Derry City with the 1911 census. If any amateur historians want to do all this for me and save me a lot of time, you're more than welcome. So that's a sort of wider project. At the end of all that, I will have something like 8,000 names, so out of our sort of 100,000 that we think served in the UVF, that's a sort of reasonable sample. At the minute, we're left with only a few units that we know a lot about. The biggest sample we have is for the 1st Fermanagh Regiment of the Ulster Volunteer Force. And looking at the occupations there, they are perhaps what we would expect for Fermanagh. 57% of the men serving in it farmers or farmers' sons, 25% labourers, mostly agricultural labourers, just 6% of them skilled workers, and 2% shop assistants or clerks. So we could say that looking at all that, it seems that the first Fermanagh Regiment was quite an accurate mirror of the society that it was drawn from. That looks very much like the Protestant male society of Fermanagh in that period. And that's interesting because historians looking at the Irish Volunteers in IRA in 1917-1923 have come to very different findings. Just Augustine and Peter Hart came to the conclusion that the Irish Volunteers IRA drew disproportionately on the skilled working classes and on lower middle class groups. So an awful lot of shop clerks and local schoolmasters, things of that sort, were what was found in the Irish Volunteers IRA, not the more widespread mirror of the society as a whole that we seem to see in the Ulster Volunteer Force. Some Unionist articles in the press at the time were at pains to point out the egalitarian nature of the force, and this I think was probably a little overplayed by A.T.Q. Stewart in his book on the Ulster Crisis. The Northern Whig wrote of a parade of the East Belfast Regiment, about 3,000 strong they claimed, and their report said that men of all classes, an MP, clergymen, doctors, professional men, merchants, artisans, workers from the shipyards, workmen from every industry in Belfast were in the ranks. So an idea of a sort of shared service there. But of course there was great variation in the social structure of different UVF units. For the West Belfast Regiment we have a pen portrait by Lillian Spender, wife of Wilfred Spender, senior staff officer in the Ulster Volunteer Force that I've mentioned. And she said that the West Belfast Regiment is the poorest of all. I mean its men are of a lower class than the others, as they're all in Devlin's constituency, which is the slummiest in the city. Many of the men look just the type you see loafing about public houses and were no better dressed, but they marched every bit as well as the others and looked just as keen and determined. So an idea that we've got quite a lot of difference between the East and West Belfast regiments there, as we might expect. The Royal Irish Constabulary put in very detailed reports on the Ulster Volunteer Force, although how well these were put together is an interesting question. The events of 1919-1921, the events of 1916, show that whatever else it was, the Royal Irish Constabulary was not a particularly effective detective force. And of course a lot of the UVF drills and so on are held in closed orange halls, warehouses, factories, where the police can't really get in to see what's going on. But one of the more interesting reports is from autumn 1913, when the Belfast UVF felt that recruitment in Belfast was being opened up to what they termed the rougher classes. So the idea that originally men had been sort of carefully screened, thought given to who would be armed and so on, but then an idea that from essentially September 1913, that what was important was large numbers of men on parade in demonstrations against Home Rule. The age range of the Ulster Volunteers also varies considerably in different areas. In areas where Unionists were in a pretty firm majority, the sort of British Army type age of about 17 to 45, 50 seems to have been more or less adhered to. But there are examples elsewhere of some young teenagers being involved. There's certainly a 13-year-old involved in County Cavan and a few 14-year-olds in Fermanagh, and equally there's examples of men in their 70s in the Fermanagh rolls. We do get some newspaper accounts that talk of men who join the UVF out of sentiment that are quite elderly, but will be able to play a role in defending their own homes and so on. There's also, somewhat surprisingly, some evidence of Catholic membership of the Ulster Volunteer Force, notably in Lisburn and County Antrim. I'm not going to stand here and tell you this runs into the hundreds, but there's an account there of 6 Catholics who enlist in the local UVF unit, so we shouldn't completely dismiss the idea of Catholic unionism over Catholic nationalism at this point. To turn then to the firearms that the UVF has. Calculating the total numbers that were available to the force is pretty much impossible. A.T.Q. Stewart in his Ulster Crisis provided an incredibly precise figure, saying that in July 1914 the force had 37,048 rifles. Josephine Howe in her article on the Ulster Volunteer Force said that the force had 60,000 rifles by May 1914, so there's quite a gap between those two figures. The major gun running coup of April 1914 into Larne Doherty Bangor is thought to have brought in 20,000 rifles, but there were many other small-scale gun-running endeavours. In 1917, when there were fears that the NRA would raid UVF depots and take possession of their rifles, 54,130 military rifles of various patterns were placed under the care of the British military authorities, although it's clear that a number of UVF rifles remained in private hands after that point. So we've got all sorts of figures to play about with there. The real problems in trying to work this out are I think, twofold. One is that pretty obviously at the time the RIC, the customs couldn't work out how many rifles were being smuggled into Ulster, and trying to piece that all together in retrospect is pretty much impossible. Internal UVF paperwork was also unclear about this, because a lot of UVF commanders were worried that if they declared they had quite a lot of rifles, then the next move by UVF headquarters would be to say, well, you've got an awful lot, these people have very few, you need to send lots of your rifles to them. So there seems to have been real concerns by some UVF commanders that headquarters shouldn't know too much about what they actually did have. There's also the point that I should make that firearms legislation was incredibly lax in the period before 1920. As long as you paid 10 shillings for a firearms certificate, firearms licence, that was the end of the matter as far as the government was concerned. They viewed it largely as an excise matter rather than a criminal matter. So no sort of tests for criminal records, no psychiatric evaluation or anything of that sort. So if we take all that together, it seems likely that most members of the UVF could have been provided with a firearm of some sort in the event of an outbreak of trouble, but a lot of those would have been old rifles, shotguns, pretty low quality revolvers, but still quite important military assets. The military rifles that were purchased by the UVF were of a wide variety of designs, calibers and vintages. The arsenal consisting of Lee Metfords, Martini Henrys, Martini Enfields, Mausers, Steyrs and Viterli rifles. Charles Townshend has stated that this would have created a logistical nightmare in any conflict, because these rifles all took different types of ammunition, so trying to supply all of that would have been largely impossible for the UVF's rather thin logistical tail. Most of the rifles were of a single shot variety, so weren't magazine rifles, and a large minority of the rifles were Viterli rifles. And you don't have to be a particularly gifted military historian to work out that Italian rifles that had been withdrawn from service in the Italian army in 1887 were not at the cutting edge of weapons technology by the time we get to 1913 and 14. Brigadier General Count Gleeson, who was the British Army commander in Belfast, came across some of these rifles. Supposedly he was off at a Unionist friend's house playing croquet, reached into the croquet box to take out a mallet and grabbed a rifle instead, and this was a Viterli. But he said that these things were, as he put it, not good but weedy and weak, and cost 5 francs a piece, including belt and bayonet, and he was of the view that if they were fired they were likely to blow up rather than discharge their bullet. And the problems with the Viterli then show another issue that UVF headquarters has in attempts to try and redistribute rifles. And we do end up in this situation where those counties that had particular political pull, Antrim Down particularly, Belfast, end up with a disproportionately large number of the better rifles, and the less prized rifles, to put it mildly, the Italian ones and so on, tend to be dumped onto those in Monaghan and Cavan particularly. So real problems there in how rifles and so on are dispersed. So we could say that from a military point of view, Ulster Volunteers end up in position where units that were in the most danger in any scenario we could think of were likely to be the worst equipped in terms of the rifles that they had. And all of the 11 machine guns that the UVF had were concentrated in the Belfast regiments, large it seems, so they could be hauled around the streets of Belfast for propaganda purposes rather than anything else. If we think then about military training and military capabilities, a number of slides we can show you here. I mentioned the Dispatch Riders Corps. That's quite a nice photograph police collection, again trying to show us the very modern approaches that the UVF had, and a lot of the UVF internal material talks about their use of motor cars and how they've developed that much faster than the British Army itself. But beyond that, we've seen a few of these photographs already, but there's varying degrees of preparedness and so on. That's the UVF guard up at James Craig's house, Craigavon, supposedly in a position to prevent Craig and Carson being arrested if it came to it in mid-1914. So this is supposedly one of the better organised units of the UVF. And the Manor Cunningham one there we've already seen. Again, this looks like men pretty much in civilian clothes, although with the interesting slouch hats of Boer War fame. And then we get to a lot of the sort of presentational parades. You can see this is a large-scale parade for the South Belfast Regiment of the Ulster Volunteers to be given their standards. Their flags are being consecrated there at a drumhead service. And we have another example of that too. South Down Regiment there. We can see a large number of clergy there on the right at this parade. Presumably the actual UVF regiment is drawn up to the left of the shot, so we can appreciate many of them. And that's one of the flags for us to look at, hopefully. Yes, this is the 2nd Larne Battalion's flag, now supposedly in 1st Larne Presbyterian Church, if anybody's down that way. You'll notice that the tag line in the centre is for God and Country rather than for God and Ulster, which is quite an interesting diversion. So a lot of what the UVF is doing throughout 1913 and 1914 is these public parades and is very much propaganda related. But there are some other training moves going on, and we'll look at a few of these. I'll just turn to that as I talk on a bit. Now, the training provided for the Ulster Volunteer Force was very patchy and depended on the availability of sufficient instructors. It seems that most UVF units tried to carry out one evening's drill per week in 1913 and early 1914. Most then tried to upgrade that to 2 drill evenings a week or a Saturday afternoon drill along with an evening drill. Camps of instruction were set up for UVF officers and NCOs from autumn 1913. The camps of instruction brought in fairly small numbers of men, 150, 200, that sort of number per county, because the men themselves had to pay for their accommodation and meals. So not only did they have to get a week off their work, but they then had to pay for the privilege of going to these camps of instruction. And I've always wondered a bit about this, because you do see the most famous one, the first one that's set up, is at Barons Court in County Tyrone, and we do have sort of orders and instructions and so on there. And I do wonder how many of the men that went to that as UVF officers thought that they were going to be sort of put up in the big house and looked after by all these servants. It would be a sort of Downton Abbey type holiday, whereas they actually end up being shoved into the stables for the week, which presumably wasn't particularly comfortable or luxurious. But there was then an attempt to bring out field days for entire UVF regiments as we get into particularly Easter of 1914, and that's what a number of them are doing in the July and August of 1914 as we head towards the First World War. John Sayers, his diary survives here, and he was a former company sergeant major and was then an instructor for County Fermanagh. So he furiously cycled around the whole of Fermanagh to inspect different UVF units, and he noted in August and September 1913 that the drill we had witnessed ranged from the poor to the exemplary, and that had already ceased in some areas. And there was a point that in many areas the very sort of boring foot drill could be picked up pretty quickly, and men just didn't want to go back and do that again and again and again. This is one of the reasons it's said why the UVF is armed in a fairly wide scale in April 1914, that too many men were getting fed up with all these drill parades and so on. I'm going to create problems here, but in December 1913 the City of Derry Regiment was deemed to be carrying out only very elementary work due to the shortage of officers and instructors. That's at least what Belfast headquarters thought of things. So an idea of sort of different things going on in different areas. We do have some surviving roll books and sort of interregimental correspondence that makes the problems even clearer in some ways. In February 1914, the commander of A Company of the 2nd Northampton Regiment admitted that out of his 73 effectives, was the term he used. This is the idea of men who have passed drill and know what they're doing there. But he said that out of these effectives, only a small proportion have had any musketry practice or would know anything about a rifle. So this isn't particularly high praise for the standard of training in the North Antrim Regiment by early 1914. And a number of units suffered from very serious absentee rates. In A Company, again, 2nd North Antrim Regiment, the commanding officer reported 73 effectives, but 58 non-effectives. So he's saying that these 73 effectives aren't particularly well trained, but he's then saying there's 58 non-effectives, and he says a large proportion of these have never attended any drills, and it's questionable whether these men intend to turn out in any capacity. So an idea that there were men on the rolls of UVF units that really had shown no interest in the force at all. John Sears, as I said, travelling around Fermanagh, was rather blasé about the poor parade attendance in the 1st Fermanagh Regiment. When inspecting B Company, which is meant to be 48 strong, on the 30th of July 1913, he noted the attendance of 19 was fairly good considering busy time of year, causing many men to be late. Now the problem with Sears is that he basically says that, well, you can't expect men to come during the summer holidays because they've got other things to do, and then you're into harvest time, and then it's getting pretty close to Christmas, so there seem to be endless reasons why men aren't turning up for drill, but the basic truth of the matter is that not many are. And we see absenteeism elsewhere. George Young, commanding a battalion of the Central Antrim Regiment, reported in March 1914 that he had 950 effectives, but 1,100 non-effectives, as he went on to say, many being unknown to him or any other commander. So again, the idea that we had large numbers of men who had enrolled but hadn't turned up to any parades and had no real commitment to the force. The problem that we have in a lot of this is that the Unionist press tended to overestimate the numbers of men on parade, although something seems to slip in January 1914 when the Northern Whig reports that the East Belfast Regiment was on parade with 3,000 to 4,000 men, which sounds quite good, except that the East Belfast Regiment, the RIC, thought numbered 10,000 men. So again, problems of absenteeism there. Between March and June 1914, it seems that most UVF units stopped recruiting and started to dismiss those that were deemed to be non-effective, so there was an idea of trying to work out who was actually going to be available for any active service, as the phrase went. And this is the time also when the Special Service Force is formed, when men are asked will they serve outside their own areas. In an event of trouble, supposedly 25,000 men agree that they will serve outside their own areas, but this then raises a problem about what would be left behind. You're sort of getting this idea you're going to have, as one of the commanding officers puts it, battalions de marche that would go anywhere in the province, and a lot of seminary volunteers who wouldn't go outside their own village or own towns whenever it happened, so not a particularly effective force there perhaps. I suppose it's worth at this point saying something about the sort of likely scenarios that the UVF was going to get caught up in. Now obviously I'm not going to look terribly far into the crystal ball and try to work out what would have happened in Ulster in the summer of 1914 if war hadn't broke out in Europe. But the sort of ideas that the UVF was thinking of was basically how they would enforce the writ of the Ulster Provisional Government. The idea that Carson had was that the day that Home Rule would become effective, then the Ulster Provisional Government that had already been named would take onto itself the powers for governing the 9 counties of Ulster, and the Ulster Volunteer Force would essentially provide the military muscle, the police resources, whatever else, to make that happen. Now, in terms of what the UVF would have had to have done then, we could say that containing, that's a euphemistic term which we'll probably hear a lot more about in Surrey over the next few weeks, but containing the Irish National Volunteers and the Royal Irish Constabulary, on the face of it, that wouldn't have required much military muscle. Many RIC officers were sympathetic to the Unionist cause. Many Irish National Volunteer units were miserably armed, so on the face of it, that wouldn't have been too difficult. In terms of what the UVF would have had to have done with the British Army, that again is very questionable. There had of course been the Kerr incident in March 1914 when 60 officers of the 3rd Cavalry Brigade had said that in the event of orders being issued for them to march against the Ulster Volunteers, they wouldn't be keen to do so. So it's not technically a mutiny in that no orders were issued for them to march against the Ulster Volunteer Force, but we could say that its consequences aren't dissimilar. So again, what exactly the relationship of the army would have been is an interesting one. Would the British Army have acted against the Ulster Volunteer Force? And Lord Dunleith in County Down was quite blunt and said that his men would not act against the British Army. There was no way that the Ulster Volunteers were going to end up in a firefight with British soldiers. So different views there. In County Cavan we have a couple of rather nice snippets about what was going on there. Nugent, who's the commander, was talking about his force as a police force, saying that if things kicked off, then the Cavan Volunteer Force would be there to protect Protestants in Cavan, and that would be the end of the matter. It wasn't a military force, it wasn't an aggressive force, and they would seek to do nothing than to protect Protestant lives, Protestant property. But the problem we have with that is that Nugent hosts one of these camps of instruction in March 1914. And on the last night of camp, the officers entertained the men in the coach house in I think Lord Farnham's estate, with songs, recitations, sketches, that type of thing. And one of the UVF sergeants, Sergeant John Armstrong Bailieborough, decides to get up and thank the officers for all their work in the camp and for the high level of instruction provided. And then he goes on to say he wanted the commanding officer never to lose sight of the fact that no matter when they were called on, either by night or by day, to mobilise at a few moments' notice, they would be with him any place he required them to fall in, cheers of hear, hear, until the last man dropped, would stand by him and would cheerfully obey his orders. So here we have Nugent thinking about trying to keep a nice calm situation, and here we have some of the sergeants envisioning a sort of Zulu Rorke's Drift type scenario where they would fight to the last man. So there is that issue about what exactly some in the ranks of the UVF thought that they were there for. James Craig, raising that issue about propaganda and the military prowess of the UVF, said that the UVF shouldn't engage in guerrilla activity because the men probably wouldn't stand for it, but also that this wouldn't play out well in Britain. In Britain this would lead up, this would sort of evoke memories of Boer commando tactics from the South African War, so definite problems there. Sorry, my computer is timed out on us. But in theory, what all members of the UVF were working towards were these certificates of proficiency, and these are for drill, shooting, signalling. When I went to visit one county museum that must remain nameless, I was shown a box of these and asked, did I want any of them? This shows you how few of them were actually issued to men and how few of them were thought to have reached these standards of drill and proficiency. And it says a lot that this is the only photograph that I think we've been able to turn up at PRONI or anywhere else, which seems to show UVF members actually practicing with rifles. This appears to be one of the camps. I'm not quite sure we could work out where it was, but it did look to us to be a UVF camp rather than an Ulster Division camp. But many UVF members, it seems to me, never had any real chance to fire a rifle. The levels of instruction were, in any case, patchy depending on who was available. I sort of worked through everything for Carson's Army, a few extra names have come up, but essentially I was getting the figure of about 132 ex-British Army officers that were able to instruct the UVF, and out of a force of 100,000, that obviously wasn't very many. The number of experienced sergeants and so on was equally limited. I'll finish up today then by saying a little about the Ulster Volunteer Force and the First World War. Initially there were plans that the Ulster Volunteer Force would form an army corps of 2 divisions, and also that the UVF would remain in Ulster as a home defence force. So there are quite complicated meetings going on where there's recruiting for the regular army, for the new army, the Ulster Division, and also recruiting going on to fill up UVF battalions as men were leaving them to join other units. It was September 1914 until a deal was hammered out over Home Rule. Essentially the deal was that Home Rule would pass, but that at the end of the war there would be some arrangements made for the exclusion of Ulster, and that then opens the way for Carson to offer the Ulster Volunteer Force to the British government properly. Initially everything seems to go quite well. There's an impressive series of parades in Belfast where members of the UVF marched down to enlist in the British Army. I'm not sure about the provenance of this photograph. It's something that History Ireland turned up and put in an article that I wrote for them. They claimed that it was men of the North Belfast Regiment marching into Belfast to then enlist into the British Army, but they did seem to be in British Army uniform already, so I think this is probably the Ulster Division in its parade through Belfast in 1915 before it goes over to England. But anyway, in September 1914 we get a series of carefully choreographed recruiting parades where UVF units sent them down to the old town hall to enlist in block. So we get this for the north, south and east and west Belfast regiments and for the young citizen volunteers over a 2-week period. And indeed there's 3 days in September 1914 when Belfast can claim to have the highest enlistment rate of anywhere in the UK outside London. So this is all pretty impressive, at least in the face of it. Behind all that, the problem that we have is that regiments, UVF regiments of 6,000, in some cases up to 10,000, were struggling to fill Ulster Division battalions of 1,200. And the idea that we get a UVF company or battalion that simply in block goes over to the British Army is something that we should remove from our minds. That's not how the process works. And initially things seem to be going all right in Belfast, but in rural Ulster recruitment is pretty sluggish for the Ulster Division, and it's up until March 1915 until the Ulster Division is properly formed. Now, part of that, of course, is down to how the War Office handles things. Initially, it seems that the Ulster Division will be 12 infantry battalions. Then they're asked to form another one, the Pioneer Battalion. Then they're asked to form Royal Engineer Companies, Army Service Corps companies, field ambulance units. Then they're asked to form a Cyclist Corps. Then they're asked to form a cavalry squadron. Then they're asked to have 20% reinforcements raised. So the War Office figures, demands keep going up and up and up. And we could say that against the fairly small population of Ulster, this was really very optimistic, and certainly in the period of mechanised warfare was unfortunate. Of course, also in Belfast we have the shipyards that soon go over to sort of military naval construction, and we have the expanding munitions works. Firms like Mackey's go over to munitions, and indeed it seems that Lieutenant General Sir George Richardson, in one of his more notable public speeches, goes round the workmen of Workman and Clark shipyard and tells them that they shouldn't enlist in the army, that what they're doing there is more valuable, in which case he was preempting what the Admiralty didn't find out until spring 1915, when they had to recall quite a lot of fairly well-trained soldiers to help out the shipyards there. The sort of best estimates that the British government comes up with, but are really guesstimates, it has to be said, are that something like 1/3 of the Ulster Volunteers enlist, something like 31,000 men, but into a variety of different units, into the Irish Regular Battalions, into the 10th Irish Division, as well as into the 36th Ulster Division. And it also seems that a number of men enlist in British units that had been stationed in Ulster before the outbreak of the war. So apparently quite a lot of men from Hollywood enlist in the Norfolk Regiment, because the Norfolk Regiment was a palace barracks and they felt affinity with that. They played football matches against it. So there's different patterns there. So the figures that we have are far from insignificant in terms of recruitment, but it's not enough to raise and sustain an entire division in World War I terms. Otherwise, the Ulster Volunteer Force tries to rebrand itself as a home defence force, and some plans are drawn up by UVF headquarters for the defence of coast of Antrim and Down.
Attention please, documents cannot be ordered after 8 p.m. It would be appreciated if documents no longer required are returned to the issue desk as soon as possible. Thank you for your cooperation.
If anyone wants to rush out, there's a good tip at the moment. Recruiting for the UVF and drilling, though, seemed to cease pretty quickly in most areas. Former soldiers have been recalled to the colours, the enthusiasm enlisted in the Ulster Division, and what was left behind was really not a particularly effective force. Indeed, the nadir which the Ulster Volunteer Force reaches in 1916 is noticeable by what happens in the Easter Rising, when the Ulster Volunteer Force manages to mobilise a mere 1,200 men to help out with special constable duties at that point. So I'll end up there and invite your questions and comments if you have any. Thank you.